Welcome to the lecture for Unit 15, Effective Learning Environments. This lecture will cover classroom management and more. Specifically, we will talk about what is an effective learning environment. We'll talk about the impact of time on learning. We'll discuss practices that contribute to effective classroom management. We'll also discuss strategies for managing routine misbehavior as well as more serious behavior problems. First, what is an effective learning environment? Creating effective learning environments involves strategies that teachers use to maintain appropriate behavior and respond to misbehavior in the classroom. Effective learning environments keep students interested and engaged and show enthusiasm, and they're important to preventing misbehavior. You can create an effective learning environment if you know a set of techniques and you apply them. It's important to have an effective learning environment because it does impact time on learning. Here we must explore some definitions. Allocated time is the time available for instruction. If your school day starts at 8 and goes till 3, you might think you have 7 hours for instruction. However, you don't have 7 hours because students must eat lunch. If you teach lower grades, they go out for recess. All types of things interrupt instruction. So you get a certain amount of limited allocated time for instruction. It's your job to maximize allocated time. There are things that you as a teacher can do to maximize allocated time for learning. These things include preventing late starts and early finishes. You want to start your class on time and you want to have enough teaching material to go until the end of class. Preventing interruptions. A certain number of interruptions throughout the school day are inevitable, but you can limit them. Handling routine procedures smoothly and quickly. For example, there's no need for the passing of papers to require half the period. And finally, you can minimize time spent on discipline. Let's look at a typical school day. This figure comes from your textbook, and it's a pie chart. You can see the dark purple area, 60%. That means that students were engaged in instructional activities only 60% of the scheduled time. By the way, this was in an elementary school math class. What happened to the other 40% of instructional time? Well, look at the red area. In the red area, there were no math lessons scheduled on 11% of the days. There could have been a field trip, teacher absence, standardized test, and other school events. Non-instructional activities occupied an additional 17% of the scheduled time. So that might have included late starts, announcements, passing out of materials. And finally, the green area, 12%, students were not engaged in learning because they were pencil sharpening, daydreaming, goofing off, assignments finished early. So in a typical day here, only 60% of the allocated instructional time was actually used for instruction. You as a teacher can minimize off-task time, and some of this lecture will cover some of the strategies you can use. So how do you use engaged time effectively? Engaged time, or time on task, is the time individual students spend actually doing assigned work. And you as the teacher, you must protect time on task. One of the ways you can protect time on class task is through effective classroom management. Let's clarify the difference between two terms that are often confused: classroom management and discipline. Classroom management refers to methods used to organize classroom activities instruction, physical structure, and other features to make effective use of time, to create a happy and productive learning environment, and to minimize behavior problems and other disruptions. Discipline refers to methods to prevent behavior problems and to respond to existing behavior problems so as to reduce their occurrence in the future. Discipline is a component or an element of classroom management, but classroom management consists of much more than discipline. At the beginning of the year, you have a lot of decisions to make about how to set up your classroom. How you set up your classroom impacts student behavior in the classroom. Let's take a look at some questions you will need to consider. How will desks be arranged? If you put students in rows facing forward, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. For example, there will probably be less talking. However, there will probably be less cooperative learning as well. How will students enter the class? Some instructors prefer to have students line up outside the door so they can control the entry of students in the class. If you do allow students to enter your classroom at bell change, consider having a do now or a bell ringer or tasks that they get right to work on. What will happen after they enter the class? How will papers be passed? Many teachers assign the first person in a row to pass the papers back. If you're in cooperative groups with desks grouped together in groups of 4 or 5, you might have one person in each group that be designated the paper passer. The whole point of considering how papers will be passed is to make sure that it's done quickly and efficiently. How will you make sure students have supplies? Again, having a supply area in your room is very helpful. Many times, the school PTA or a parent may be willing to fund that. How will you deal with no-name papers? I have seen classrooms shut down because the teacher spends 15 minutes trying to figure out whose papers have no name. One trick you can use is simply to have a basket in your room and put all the no-name papers in the basket. Students can go and check that basket for their papers. What about bathroom breaks? Teachers may or may not allow a bathroom break. I think it's important to consider students' bodily needs. However, you also want to monitor this. Many teachers have a sign-out sheet for a bathroom break, and then they can peruse the sign-out sheet to see how frequently individual students are going to the bathroom. If it seems excessive, they will have a discussion with the students. How will you deal with food in the classroom? Some schools have a policy against eating in the classroom. Many schools allow it. Any of these ways is fine as long as you're in compliance with the school policy. After that, it becomes personal choice. Finally, how will students leave the classroom? If your school uses a bell to indicate the end of a period, you might find yourself with 30 students all dashing to get out of the door. Think about having an orderly process where students don't leave with the bell, but rather are dismissed by you, perhaps one row at a time. Let's get started. Let's think about classroom rules and procedures. If you get your classroom rules and procedures right, you're going to cut out a lot of time off tasks, and you're going to minimize or eliminate classroom discipline issues. First of all, you should start the year properly and train your students on your procedures. You could take the first day and just practice things. For example, you could practice lining up. You could practice entering and leaving the class. You could practice putting away materials. You could practice passing papers. You need to develop rules and procedures that are presented explicitly to students. They're tied to consequences. So what happens if students break a rule? That should be clear and presented explicitly to students. Classroom rules should be applied promptly and fairly, and they should protect engaged time. There are some rules about classroom rules. 3 principles govern the process of coming up with classroom rules. Number 1 is fewer rules is better than too many rules. Now you might think you should have a rule to cover every situation. However, I've seen teachers with 25 rules and the students can't remember all the rules. You can never cover every situation. You can, however, come up with general rules that cover many situations. So for example, instead of saying don't hit others, don't talk out loud, don't do this, don't do that, you could have a rule that says respect learning, which would cover a lot of things. Respect others is another type of general rule. It covers hitting and not verbally abusing each other, etc. Finally, word rules positively. So don't say don't hit, say keep your hands to yourself. So these 3 principles guide the setting of classroom rules. Fewer rules, general rules, worded positively. Class rules should be clearly explained and deliberately taught to students on the first day of class. Consequences should also be designated. Think about what you want to happen the first time a student breaks a rule. Later in this lecture, we'll discuss how you should not start with the most severe consequence. First, you might give the students a warning. You might even back it up further and go and stand by the student and then give them a warning, and then gradually ratchet up the level of consequence. But whatever you decide to do, it should be clear in your mind and to the students the levels of consequences. Some teachers have found it effective to allow students to have input into the rules. This works very effectively at the lower grades, especially where you're only teaching one class. So generally you might start the first day out and say, what do you think our classroom rules should be? And have students working on those rules and refining the rules. You might divide them up into groups, have them each come up with a set of rules, and then compare the rules. Generally, most students will come up with similar kinds of rules that you can then refine, word positively, and come up with a list of class rules. The reason that this is very effective is that students then buy into the rules because they've had input into them, and so they'll come to understand the reason for the rules better. There are strategies to maximize time on task. As we've said, apply a limited number of rules consistently and fairly. Manage your transitions. In other words, transitions are times that students are moving from one activity to another, or they're moving in or out of the classroom. Use signals such as the light blinking. Tell students in advance that there's a transition coming. Make transitions all at once. Maintain group focus during instruction. Use choral responses, whiteboards, clickers, group alerting. Research shows us that the more you can involve students in the instruction, the more learning takes place. So for example, you might give students whiteboards and say, everyone write the answer to this problem and hold it up. Or you might ask the class, everyone respond to this question. Or you might use turn and talk, where you say to the students, turn and talk to your neighbor and give them the response to this question. Teach engaging lessons. You can also maximize time on task by maintaining focus during seat work. You shouldn't be at your desk all the time during seat work. Instead, circulate among the students, check in with groups, keep the interactions brief, and go somewhere else to another group. Teachers do overlapping constantly. This means that they attend to behavior issues while continuing the lesson. So for example, if you see a student passing a note in class, there is no need to shut the lesson down. You want to keep teaching, but you could walk over to the student who is passing the note and hold out your hand. Just simply take the note and walk away. Use nonverbal clues to control behavior. You don't always have to stop what you're saying and focus on minor misbehavior. You could move closer to the student. You could make eye contact. There are many things you can do to alert the student that you see him or her doing that, and often it is the case where the student will stop that behavior. The point here is to keep the lesson going. Praise students when they exhibit good behavior. Use it to subtly point out inappropriate behavior. For example, if one student A, is behaving, and student B is not misbehaving, you could say, student B, I really like how you're focused, how you're sitting in your seat. The easiest behavior problems to deal with are those that never occur in the first place. So let's think about how you can prevent misbehavior. First of all, when students come into the classroom, have an activity that gets them busy and settles them down right away. We might call this a bell ringer or a do now. If they start to talk in class, try becoming very quiet or silence. It's amazing how students will settle down when the teacher stops talking. I have seen teachers scream above the noise, but that just makes the noise level rise. You could also try having a signal to quieten students down. Flashing the lights works well, for example. You need to deal with problem students right away. One way is to sit them by you, closer to you, and isolate them from other students where they might form a team. Present interesting and lively lessons. This means let your lessons be engaging so fewer students will be tempted to be off task. Have supplies handy. It can really slow down instruction when not everyone has the right supplies. If you're relying on students to bring pencils from home, inevitably there will be students who show up without pencils. You can keep a stack of supplies in the back of the room and just tell students to go get what they need. Have an orderly procedure for handing in assignments. Students should know right away when they come into your room what to do with last night's homework. You may wish them to keep it because you want to go over it, or you may wish them to turn it in. You might have a basket where they put their papers. If you're using electronic assignments, they should know how to do that as well. Keep all students busy on meaningful tasks, and I'll add that it's always good to have what's called an anchor activity that students can do if they finish their assignment. The anchor activity may be to bring a book to class to read, or you may actually have additional worksheets or exploratory materials in the back of the room that students are to go and work on if they finish their assignment. Let's discuss how to prevent misbehavior. Most misbehavior can be prevented before it even occurs. First, you need to give brief verbal reminders when necessary. Refuse to be a broken record, constantly repeating the reminder. The more you repeat a reminder, sit down please, Johnny, sit down, don't get out of your seat, please sit down, the more the students will tune you out. Your rules should be strong and speak for themselves. Instead of telling Johnny to sit down, you might say, Johnny, this is your first warning, you're out of your seat. And then you ratchet it up. Apply those consequences consistently and fairly. Students will come to understand if you have favorites, and they will play off against you for being your favorite. Instead, let the rules establish the consequences, and let the consequences apply to everyone. The consequences for breaking rules should be reasonable, doable, and a little unpleasant. So you don't want to allow students to go to another classroom and play on their Game Boy. That would be pleasant. Instead, you want to isolate students if that's one of your consequences, and have them do something that is not pleasant. Let's discuss group alerting. When you are asking questions, it's important to alert the whole group that there is a question coming, and not call on an individual until the end of the question. Students will pay more attention to your questions if they don't know who you're going to call on. So state your question first and reveal who you will call on at the end. For example, what is the second stage of mitosis? Amy. Until you mention the name Amy, students will think that you might call on them. Also, you can ask students about previous answers. What did Amy just say was the second stage of mitosis? John. Asking students about previous answers will ensure that they're paying attention to the classroom discussion. Let's discuss the principle of least intervention. The principle of least intervention means using the simplest methods that will work. Your main goal in dealing with routine misbehavior is to do so in a way that is both effective and avoids unnecessarily disrupting the lesson. As I said before, you don't want to start with a severe consequence for the first offense of breaking a rule. If at all possible, the lesson must go on while you deal with behavior issues. Let's take a look at a continuum of strategies for dealing with minor misbehaviors from the least disruptive to the most disruptive. Here is a table that gives 7 levels of consequences for breaking a rule. First of all is prevention. We've discussed that you can display enthusiasm, vary the activities, have engaging lessons, keeping students interested. So that's level 1 for dealing with misbehavior. However, let's suppose something occurs that you have to deal with. Let's say your student Tanya turns in a paper late. All you have to do is frown or give her a look. That's a nonverbal cue that indicates your displeasure with Tanya turning in her paper late. But it's Tanya's first offense, so we hope that that will be sufficient. If Tanya has turned in her paper late again, but perhaps she's done something else well, you might consider praising her for that good behavior. Tanya, I hear you completed your science fair project on time for the judging. That's great. A next level up would be to praise other students. I see most of you turned in your papers on time today. I really appreciate that. Finally, you get to specific verbal reminders for Tanya. Tanya, please turn in your paper next on time. You can repeat the reminder. It's important to turn in your paper on time. And finally, there would be consequences. Now, consequences are broken out into different levels themselves. First, you might have her spend 10 minutes after class starting on the next paper's assignment. Another level might be that you call home and say Tanya's grades are slipping because her papers are late or she's not turning them in. And so you can ratchet up the consequences as well as these prevention of misbehaviors and small reminders. Here is a summary of what we've learned in this lecture. First, we must preserve on-task or engaged time. Let's set a few fair rules and enforce them consistently. Prevent misbehavior by setting up your classroom appropriately, developing engaging lessons, using nonverbal cues, and group alerting. Have procedures for classroom routines such as transitions and more. And use the principle of least intervention when managing classroom behavior. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and it's helped you understand efficient classrooms a little bit more.